I'd now like to introduce you to Dr. Marilyn Thompson. She's an independent consultant on gender and social development, and she's co-director and founding member of the UK-based Central America Women's Network. She lived in Latin America and worked as a global gender advisor for Save the Children. She's also lived in many countries in Asia, the Middle East, Africa and Latin America, and she's the author of today's paper. Dr. Marilyn Thompson.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with you today, and it's a great privilege to be on the panel with such eminent women as Mary Robinson and Nora Owen. So I'm really pleased to be able to present this paper, which we're launching here today. It's been a really interesting piece of research I've undertaken with Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence. I'd also like to thank colleagues on the consortium for their feedback and comments in developing the research. It's a longer report, which will also be available in the next few weeks for people who are interested. Now, in developing this report, I had some questions that I was looking into. The Millennium Development Goals have been the leading framework for international development since 2000. So I was asked to look at the focus given to gender equality and women's empowerment and the limitations in terms of addressing gender-based violence. And this with a view to making recommendations on what might be in any future framework post-2015. So I looked at all the literature. There's lots of reports and information. If anyone's interested online, there's an awful lot of information out there. The UN especially has developed a number of reviews and evaluations of the progress in the Millennium Development Goals. But I also spoke to a number of directors of women's organizations in Tanzania, Uganda, Honduras, here in Ireland, and also to local staff of consortium members in Pakistan, Nepal, in Thailand, and to academics and policymakers. So we've built the research around the views of a wide range of people. And so they inform the content of the research and the summary that we're presenting here today. These are the Millennium Development Goals, and I won't go into a lot of detail because I'm sure you already know what these commitments are, to halve the proportion of people whose income is under $1 a day, to halve the proportion of people who suffer from hunger, achieve universal primary education, reduce by 3/4 the maternal mortality rate, halt and reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS. So as Nora explained, these MDGs are used by governments and the UN to assess progress on development indices. And there have been some notable achievements. Nevertheless, continuing gender inequalities impact on the achievement of all of these goals. And women's poverty is in part caused by gender inequality because of their unpaid caring role and as managers of household and food security, and also as a result of unequal distribution of resources. So these gender disparities leave women and girls disproportionately vulnerable to shocks such as rising food and fuel prices and environmental disasters, and because they have fewer assets and resources to cushion them. The particular Goal 3, which was on promoting gender equality and empowering women, had a focus on education, and you can see from these indices that there were also some other issues that were looked at. And we've heard about some of the achievements that have been made in meeting these targets. And although there has been some progress globally, there are disparities in regions and in some countries where the deadline is going to be missed for Goal 3. So gender discrimination is apparent in lower rates of secondary education enrollment for girls, underrepresentation of women in many national parliaments, and the wide gender gaps in access to decent employment, and the gender natures of the HIV pandemic. So we still have to fight against entrenched attitudes and social norms that put women in a lower status and who have unequal access to economic resources and opportunities. So this means that gender inequality persists in many countries. What we see is that the MDG on education is that this isn't enough. It's not sufficient to eliminate a wide range of gender inequalities. In the progress report by the Millennium Task Force on Education, they identified 7 strategic priorities in order to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment. You'll see from this list that the task force reckoned that to change existing female disadvantage in most societies, women and girls must enjoy equal rights, equal economic opportunities, equal representation in decision-making bodies, and freedom from threat of violence and coercion. So these challenges are recognized as being really important to tackle in the new agenda. And in spite of these challenges, the MDGs have been useful in terms of raising the profile of gender equality issues at a policy level and internationally. Having Goal 3 has forced governments to report on gender equality, and this has enabled women's organizations to advocate for women's rights and to hold their governments to account. For example, in the interview that I had with somebody from the World Bank, he said that the MDGs had been a guiding framework for the World Bank in the last 12 years and led to the World Bank giving specific attention to gender equality and development. So in spite of this progress, much remains to be done. And no region of the developing world are women and men equal. And there are gender gaps in access to and control of resources, in economic opportunities, in power and political voice. But as Nora alluded to, gender-based violence is the missing dimension of the MDGs. Although the Millennium Declaration, which heralded the start of the MDGs, committed the UN to combat all forms of violence against women and girls, this focus on rights was lost in the MDGs, which became more of a technical tool. And although there has been progress on some of the indicators, the MDGs haven't tackled the underlying structural barriers. And there's been least progress on MDG 5 to reduce maternal mortality, which is in part due to the failure to tackle the root causes of the problem: gender inequality, violence against women, and women's low status in society. Violence restricts women's ability to use their capabilities and to take advantage of opportunities and reinforces gender inequalities. And these are just a few alarming statistics. Violence against women and girls is prevalent in epidemic proportions in many countries around the world and persists in many forms: intimate partner violence, harmful practices, violence in public spaces and in the workplace, and there are growing forms of violence such as trafficking and femicide. Because gender-based violence is often hidden, it's difficult to give accurate statistics. So numbers could be much higher than these estimates I've given here. Gender-based violence has direct implication for progress on all the MDGs. It's an obstacle to achieving the education, health, and HIV targets, and also impacts on productivity and well-being. For example, in economic downturns, increasing poverty can trigger an increase in violence against women and girls. One of the persons I interviewed, Ishrat, she stated that in Pakistan there's been a very limited interpretation of the MDGs. Even the specific Goal 3 is restricted. Gender equality goes beyond education and poverty, and gender roles are critical regarding women's control of land and the division of labor. Gender-based violence is very important in every sector. It was stressed in all the interviews I carried out that gender-based violence is an obstacle to realizing the specific MDG goals, especially MDG 3 to promote gender equality and empower women. And other research indicates that girls' attendance at school is affected by gender-based violence. For example, Nora has already mentioned that this can prevent girls from going on to secondary school, and not only sexual harassment, but girls get married off very young in some countries, and early marriage puts an end to their education. This lack of focus on gender-based violence in the MDG framework is considered to be a very serious omission by civil society organizations working on women's rights. For example, a survey that was carried out by the Association of Women in Development, AWID, which was completed by over 1,000 women's organizations from over 140 countries, highlighted by 59% that violence against women and girls is a top priority. And 24% identified violence against women in peacebuilding and conflict situations as a main priority. In the interviews for this report, there was a broad consensus of opinion that violence against women and girls is one of the top development issues, and it should be included in any new framework post-2015. An obstacle to integrate violence is the lack of accurate statistical data. For example, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Rashida Manjoo, emphasized that the scope and prevalence of violence against women and girls is a global problem, but it's difficult to know the exact extent and to make visible the many different forms of violence because of lack of data in many countries. This was also recognized by a UN expert group which was meeting on how to measure progress on ending gender-based violence. And they proposed a core set of indicators which would be identified and will serve as a nuclear for a broad set of internationally used indicators on violence against women and girls. This UN expert group also recognized that violence against men is an important issue requiring attention. But this violence takes different forms and is not rooted in power imbalances and structural relationships of inequality between women and men. So there will be different sorts of actions necessary. Turning now to the post-2015 agenda. This must look at the issue of inequalities, especially gender inequalities. The UN Secretary General's progress report underlines that it will be an opportunity to take action and to invest in human rights-based approaches and to address gender-based violence in a comprehensive way. In addition, the 2015 Development Agenda will need to address other emerging challenges. They have identified a core dimension for this new agenda. These four interconnected dimensions are going to be a basis for defining goals and targets, and a consultation process has only just started, so these aren't set in stone, they're just a guiding idea for what might be included. The agenda will also build on the goals identified in the Rio +20 Conference for Sustainable Development, and these are still being elaborated and will be presented to the UN in 2013. And they will be integrated into these discussions on the post-2015 agenda. So this process is underway. The UN has initiated a number of global consultations on 9 different themes and 50 country-led consultations that civil organizations can feed into. And the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence has presented a paper to this consultation on addressing inequalities. Peace and security are being considered as core dimensions in the future framework, and they will also be a consultation on this theme. Findings from research conducted from the consortium in Sierra Leone last year on the prevalence of gender-based violence,
Sorry to interrupt, but this is a very important presentation. But we're also very conscious, unfortunately, that Mary has a prior commitment which we knew about some time ago.
Okay, well, we get on to the nitty-gritty now, looking at the post-2015 agenda. And I mentioned that these dimensions are being considered, but also that peace and security, which are issues that the Irish Consortium have worked on and indeed have written papers about, also considered to be very important for inclusion in any new framework. And there is a research project that the Consortium undertook on Sierra Leone, if you're interested in looking at their position on gender-based violence in peace building and conflict resolution. So we have, in this paper, we've identified the following recommendations for the post-2015 agenda. So these are actions that we think will help to ensure that gender equality and gender-based violence are taken into account in the discussions on the post-2015 agenda and incorporated into any future framework. We don't know if there will be a framework. We're just assuming that there will be. But this is going to be all part of the discussions, the ongoing discussions that are starting now. And so we think it's really important to get in there with what we think. So I'll go through each of these recommendations in turn. So the first one, as has been mentioned, the framework should be based on human rights. Since the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action to Advance the Goals of Equality, Development and Peace for Women in 1995, the United Nations has made a number of statements on violence against women and girls as an obstacle for international development. And they have a UN global campaign, Unite campaign, on violence against women. And there are other existing international obligations and regional treaties to address the rights of women and girls. These are just some of the conventions here. It is recognized that by the UN that gender-based violence is an abuse of human rights and both a cause and consequence of gender inequality and a major factor undermining development. Violence against women and girls and peace and security are two of the focus areas of UN Women, the new UN entity for women's rights created in 2010. In addition, they manage this UN Trust Fund to support actions to eliminate violence against women, to support local, national, and regional efforts to combat violence. But much more needs to be done at both national and international levels to end violence against women and girls. Our research found, for example, in Uganda, Tanzania, and in Honduras, where they have laws and policies and targets in place to address violence against women, these are not being implemented, and they haven't translated into concrete actions. In Honduras, it's a huge issue that no actions are being taken to reduce the impunity for the perpetrators of violence against women. Women are scared to go to the police to report incidences of violence because they don't know what reaction they're going to get from the police. In other countries, progress is even slower. In Pakistan, they are struggling to get the domestic violence bill passed in all provinces. And women's access to justice and services is a big issue. So we need to continue to promote the rights-based approach. We're also proposing a twin-track approach. And what do we mean by this? We mean, first of all, that in any new framework, it's important to have a standalone domain on gender equality with targets to address gender-based violence and the structural barriers to gender equality. This is important to hold governments accountable and to prioritize actions to address violence against women and girls. We mentioned earlier how important having Goal 3 was at that international policy level to hold governments to account. So this needs to continue. Also, specific targets and indicators on gender equality and gender-based violence should be integrated into other dimensions of the framework and mainstreamed into multi-sector programs. We've already mentioned how gender inequality and gender-based violence affects issues such as education, health, livelihoods, security. And all the practitioners that we spoke to suggested that this multi-pronged approach is necessary to work on gender-based violence at different levels in order to prevent, protect, and promote actions against violence. Having a twin-track approach will help advocacy initiatives, prevention campaigns, and focus policy priorities, making it a shared responsibility of governments, police, justice systems, the media, and all citizens. So turning to the recommendation 3, benchmarks and indicators, it's very important to have new targets agreed and benchmarks and indicators to measure progress. And the UN expert group gave an indication of some of the different forms of violence that they think ought to be measured. And they are looking into developing indicators on these different forms. It's recognized that the scope and prevalence of violence against women and girls is a global problem, but it's also difficult to know the exact extent and make visible different forms of violence because of a lack of data and insufficient quality data in many countries. So agreeing these new targets would mean ensuring appropriate data is gathered and analysed, and new indicators are developed. These international indicators are important because they will motivate governments to collect data on gender equality and violence against women, and to monitor the extent of such violence and trends over time. Having specific targets will make gender-based violence more visible and enable civil society organisations to build more effective programs, to monitor progress and hold their governments to account. In order to develop indicators on gender-based violence, it's necessary to agree the categories of common, widespread forms of violence for which data will be collected and ensure that these are comparable internationally. This issue of a lack of data was highlighted by a number of our interviewees, and they suggested that there were many reasons for this at a local level. For example, the under-reporting by victims who are too scared to go to the police, as I mentioned, and also the under-recording by the police who don't take it seriously. And also because there isn't a standardized format for gathering data. So this makes it difficult to compare available information across countries and regions. So it's really important that we have data on prevalence rates, and this will help us to define protection strategies and to provide services. Data collection in the emergency, conflict, and post-conflict situation is even more challenging, but it's not impossible if there's flexibility and innovative approaches are adopted. One of our recommendations is to increase gender analysis. And this is really important to strengthen capacity, not just for gender analysis, but to increase understanding of the underlying causes of gender-based violence. The MDG targets don't indicate whether progress on the goals has been broad-based or equitable, which has led to a discussion about the lack of attention made to inequality and social justice for marginalized groups. So there's been a lot of discussions about how the averages that are measured by the MDGs bypass poorer people and socially excluded groups. And we therefore recommend that national surveys should include all ethnic and population groups, migrants, refugee women and girls, and that data are disaggregated according to gender and characteristics such as ethnicity, age, disability, legal status, and location, which Nora had mentioned in her presentation. So this will mean more extensive sampling and training to strengthen capacity for analysis of gender and diversity nationally and internationally. And it also, of course, means allocating resources for training on gender analysis and building capacity for research and data collection. In the longer term, this will contribute to increased awareness and enhance the capacity of governments to evaluate legislative and policy reforms and take actions to address and eliminate violence against women. Finally, we want to talk about a global partnership for development. This is really important to keep high on the post-2015 agenda. Along with gender equality, the empowerment of women must continue to be a key focus in any new framework and must include listening to women. Linked to this, an essential component of a future global partnership for development must ensure adequate financial resources for women's organizations to work towards ending violence against women. So we have some recommendations about finance. We think, for example, that a new partnership should include gender budgeting, which will help to identify spending priorities for governments and track resource allocation for gender equality and gender-based violence programs. And also to assess the full cost of gender-based violence in the health, education, welfare, and judiciary sectors. Increased funding could then be made available internationally for specific initiatives on gender-based violence, especially prevention work, work for women's participation and advocacy initiatives. The cost of providing services for women survivors of violence is very high, and it's often women's organizations rather than the state that provide support services for survivors of violence. In the current economic downturn we see here in Europe, state welfare services have been cut, women's refuges are being closed, and women's organizations are struggling to fund their work, while the situation is even worse in many developing countries. The inclusion of specific targets in a post-2015 framework will hopefully lead to increased funding for gender-based violence initiatives globally. For example, the UN Trust Fund for Actions to Eliminate Violence Against Women, which is managed by UN Women, receives many substantive proposals every year, amounting to over $1 billion. And there's a need out there, and donors have to respond and give priority to and provide increased resources for these types of activities. We also feel that mechanisms have to be in place to ensure civil society is involved in the process of developing the 2015 framework and in monitoring progress in reaching new targets through alternative shadow reporting. This might be one mechanism. And we also propose that the voices of women and girls should be sought, supported, and taken into account at all stages. And the new global targets must include empowering women and girls, supporting community actions to change negative norms and traditions, which means engaging with men and boys to involve them to make these changes. In finishing this presentation, I'd like to say that there are a number of opportunities coming up to engage with the 2015 debate, and it's important to encourage your partner organizations, human rights, development, civil society organizations, particularly women's rights groups, to participate in these processes and ensure that gender-based violence and gender equality are adequately considered and included in the new framework. I'd like to give the last word to one of the women I interviewed, who's the director of a migrant women's organization here in Dublin. I don't know, she might be in the audience. Salome had this to say: women on the ground have to be at the center of a new framework, but often the women who are affected by violence haven't been empowered enough to be engaged as agents of change in the process. We need to support and empower women on the ground to get access to resources, access to justice and services. Thank you very much.